Hollywood in the 1950s was obsessed with war, yet the films that really defined the genre weren't the ones that filled theaters with fanfare. They were the gritty, the flawed, and the ones studios didn't brag about. These dramas revealed soldiers as human, fragile, and sometimes downright broken. But here's the question. Do you remember them? Or have they been buried beneath blockbusters? Stick around, because a few of these forgotten dramas may shock you. Fixed Bayonets. 1951. A snow-covered nightmare where survival meant stabbing the frozen ground just to stay sane. That's Samuel Fuller's Fixed Bayonets, one of the earliest and rawest portrayals of the Korean War. Unlike the flag-waving films audiences expected, Fuller dropped viewers right into the mud, the ice, and the terror of a doomed rearguard action. Richard Basehart stars as Corporal Deno, a soldier haunted by the idea of command. He dreads being promoted because every promotion means inheriting more men to lead into certain death. The camera lingers not on battlefield glory, but on his fear, his hesitation, and his desperate search for courage. This was not the John Wayne version of war. Fuller himself was a World War II veteran, and his authenticity bleeds through in every frame, whether it's the crunch of boots on snow or the suffocating silence before an ambush. The film was shot on studio backlots covered with manufactured snow, but somehow Fuller created an atmosphere of bone-deep cold and isolation. The soldiers are freezing, miserable, and slowly unraveling as the enemy closes in. Critics later hailed it as one of the most psychologically rich war films of its time, even though it bombed at the box office. Fixed Bayonets deserves a second look because it asked the question so few dared. How do ordinary men actually cope when every decision means life or death? Fuller's answer wasn't comforting, and that's exactly why the film still defines the genre. The Young Lions, 1958. Marlon Brando in a Nazi uniform, already shocking, but wait until you see how far he takes it. The Young Lions, directed by Edward Dmytryk, is a sprawling World War II drama that dares to humanize all sides of the conflict. It follows three soldiers, Brando as a disillusioned German officer, Montgomery Clift as a fragile Jewish-American draftee, and Dean Martin as a cynical entertainer thrust into war. Brando's portrayal of Lieutenant Christian Diestel was revolutionary. Instead of a cartoon villain, he's shown as a man seduced by ideology, then horrified by the cruelty it unleashes. His icy blonde hair and soft-spoken menace make him unforgettable. Across the ocean, Clift delivers one of his most heartbreaking performances, showing the humiliation and quiet strength of a Jewish soldier fighting for respect among his peers. The film doesn't shy from its epic scale, stretching across battlefields in Europe and the deserts of North Africa, but its real power comes from the inner lives of its characters. When their paths finally cross, the tragedy feels inevitable, not staged. At over 2.5 hours, The Young Lions was criticized as overlong, but its ambition was unmatched. It dared to blend spectacle with deep moral questioning, a mix that confused audiences at the time, but feels ahead of its era now. Forgotten only because it was overshadowed by flashier war epics, The Young Lions remains one of the boldest dramas of the 1950s. It didn't just define the genre, it redefined how audiences could see the enemy. Battle Cry, 1955. If war was hell, then Raoul Walsh decided to show it through romance, heartbreak, and homesickness. Battle Cry wasn't about storming beaches or raising flags. Instead, it was about the lives of ordinary Marines before, during, and after battle, and the women they loved. Based on Leon Uris's best-selling novel, the film follows a group of young recruits as they train, bond, and head off to the Pacific Theater. It's less about strategy and more about how war reshapes personal lives. Van Heflin and Aldo Ray lead a cast of Marines who drink, fight, and fall in love, while Dorothy Malone and Anne Francis provide the emotional counterbalance back home. Walsh, a veteran director of both gangster films and westerns, wasn't interested in sanitized propaganda. His Marines brawl in bars, question authority, and long for love as much as victory. Shot in widescreen cinemascope, the film was visually stunning, turning even the quiet moments, like a soldier reading a letter from home, into grand cinematic set pieces. At the time, Battle Cry was dismissed as too melodramatic, too soapy. in hindsight, that's its strength. It showed that war isn't just about who wins the fight. It's about who you miss, what you lose, and how much of yourself you leave behind. For a decade obsessed with heroics, Battle Cry dared to argue that the emotional battles were just as defining as the physical ones, and that makes it unforgettable. Attack 1956. What happens when the real danger isn't the enemy, but your own commanding officer? Robert Aldrich's Attack delivers one of the most blistering takedowns of military leadership ever put on screen. This is not a story of noble generals. It's a story of cowardice, ambition, and betrayal under fire. Jack Palance stars as Lieutenant Costa, a fearless officer whose men are constantly endangered by their cowardly captain, played by Eddie Albert. Albert's performance is chilling. His Captain Cooney is indecisive to the point of recklessness, sending men to die because he can't stand the pressure. Costa finally reaches his breaking point, setting the stage for one of the tensest confrontations in 1950s cinema. The battle sequences are explosive, but Aldrich keeps the focus squarely on the psychological warfare between officers. The soldiers' frustration, the desperation for survival, and the fury at incompetent leadership make the film feel more modern than many war dramas that came decades later. On release, Attack was criticized for being too brutal, too cynical. Military groups even protested it for undermining morale. But that's exactly why it's so essential. It stripped away the glossy veneer of war films and forced audiences to face the ugly truth. Not every commanding officer deserves loyalty. Forgotten by most audiences, but revered by war film buffs, Attack is a raw nerve of a movie. It's not just a drama, it's a warning about what happens when leadership fails in the moments that matter most. Porkchop Hill, 1959. Gregory Peck, trudging up a hill of death. That image alone tells you this isn't your typical patriotic flag waver. Lewis Milestone's Porkchop Hill takes on the Korean War's most infamous battle, one fought less for victory and more for negotiation leverage during peace talks. Imagine that. Soldiers dying for a hill. Politicians might give away tomorrow. Peck stars as Lieutenant Joe Clemens, tasked with leading a company of exhausted men up the blood-soaked slopes of Porkchop Hill. What unfolds is less about glory and more about the grinding reality of attrition warfare. Men claw for inches of ground, only to lose them hours later. Reinforcements arrive too late. Supplies vanish. Hope collapses. Yet Clemens keeps pushing because orders demand it. The film's power lies in its grim detail. The battlefield is a muddy maze of trenches, barbed wire, and corpses. Soldiers scream into the night, unsure if their commanders even remember they exist. Milestone, who had directed All Quiet on the Western Front 30 years earlier, knew how to strip combat of romanticism. Here, he brings that same unflinching honesty to the Korean conflict. Audiences in 1959 were not ready. Many critics complained the film was too bleak, too political. But over time, Porkchop Hill has been recognized as a landmark war drama that dared to show war as negotiation by blood. If you want to see the moment Hollywood war films started questioning the cost of obedience, this is the hill where it happened. Retreat, Hell, 1952. A film so blunt, it uses the Marines' actual battle cry as its title. Retreat, Hell, tells the story of the 1st Marine Division's brutal retreat from the Chosin Reservoir in Korea, a 70-mile fighting withdrawal through snow, ice, and relentless enemy fire. This wasn't just another battle. It was survival against impossible odds. Frank Lovejoy leads the cast as Colonel John Stevens, a hard-nosed Marine officer determined to get his men out alive. What makes the film remarkable is its insistence on authenticity. The Marine Corps cooperated heavily, providing advisors, equipment, and even access to real training grounds. Many of the details, frozen rifles, frostbite, exhaustion, came straight from first-hand accounts. Unlike the bombastic war films of the decade, Retreat Hell is almost documentary-like. It shows soldiers collapsing in snowdrifts, trucks sliding off icy roads, and men carrying wounded comrades mile after mile. The retreat is framed not as a loss, but as a testament to endurance, the kind of grueling, forgotten story that doesn't fit into neat tales of victory. At the time, critics respected its realism, but complained it lacked entertainment value. Today, that's what makes it stand out. War isn't entertainment, and Retreat, hell, had the guts to portray it that way. While not widely remembered, the film influenced later Korean war dramas by showing that heroism can mean simply putting one frozen boot in front of the other. For audiences tired of polished victories, this was the rare 1950s film that admitted the truth. Sometimes survival is the only triumph. Time Limit, 1957. A courtroom drama with no gunfire, yet every word lands like a grenade. Time Limit, directed by Carl Malden in his only film behind the camera, tackles the taboo subject of American prisoners of war accused of collaborating with the enemy. In the paranoid 1950s, this was dynamite. Richard Widmark stars as Colonel William Edwards, assigned to investigate a decorated officer accused of treason while in a North Korean POW camp. That officer, played with quiet devastation by Richard Basehart, insists he had no choice. The tension builds as Edwards digs into the psychological torture that led to so-called collaboration. Was it betrayal or simply human breaking under inhuman conditions? The film plays out almost entirely in interrogation rooms, offices, and court chambers. But don't mistake that for dullness. Every scene crackles with moral ambiguity as witnesses describe hunger, sleep deprivation, and relentless brainwashing. Malden's direction keeps the tension claustrophobic, as though the walls themselves are closing in. What made Time Limit daring was its refusal to give easy answers. In an era of black and white patriotism, the film suggested there were gray zones that even heroes could crack, and that judgment from the safety of home was far too easy. No wonder it rattled audiences and faded quickly from theaters. Today, it feels ahead of its time, almost like a 1970s war film smuggled into the Eisenhower years. Forgotten by many, it's proof that the most explosive war stories don't always need bullets. They need courage to ask the questions nobody else will. The Rack, 1956. A young Paul Newman, trembling under interrogation, forced to confront whether survival can itself be a crime. That's the haunting core of The Rack, another courtroom war drama that dared to pull the rug out from under 1950s audiences. Newman plays Captain Edward Hall, an officer accused of collaboration while held prisoner in Korea. The setup echoes Time Limit, but where that film examined systemic pressure, The Rack zooms in on one man's internal war. Newman's Hall isn't a villain. He's broken, ashamed, and struggling to explain decisions made under unbearable duress. The courtroom becomes the battlefield, with prosecutors demanding justice and Hall's defense insisting on mercy. Newman's raw intensity gives the film its power. This was one of his earliest leading roles, and you can already see the volcanic talent that would later define his career. His haunted eyes, his stammered justifications, his rage at being judged by men who weren't there, all of it makes the drama gut-wrenching. Shot in stark black and white, the film feels stripped bare, as if the director wanted to peel away any distraction from the moral debate at its center. Critics were split. Some called it too bleak, others praised its daring honesty. Either way, it was not the kind of war film that made audiences cheer. That's exactly why it matters. The Rack doesn't give you victory parades or battlefield heroics. It gives you the cost of captivity, the shame of survival, and the impossible question, what would you have done in his place? Forgotten today, it remains one of the most piercing dramas of the 1950s war cycle. Run Silent, Run Deep, 1958. Claustrophobia, rivalry, and the ocean pressing in from every side. That's the suffocating atmosphere of Run Silent, Run Deep, one of the great submarine dramas of the 1950s. Clark Gable, playing Commander Richardson, is an aging officer obsessed with sinking a specific Japanese destroyer. Burt Lancaster, as his ambitious executive officer, doesn't buy into Richardson's obsession. Their battle of wills drives the film as much as the enemy depth charges do. What makes it unforgettable is the tension between the two stars. Gable, nearing the end of his career, plays a commander haunted by past failure, desperate for one last chance at redemption. Lancaster, at the height of his power, radiates youthful defiance. Watching them circle each other in the cramped quarters of a submarine is like watching two lions trapped in the same cage. The underwater sequences, filmed with miniatures and clever sound design, are masterclasses in suspense. The ping of sonar, the groan of pressure on steel, the silence before an explosion, each moment makes you feel trapped alongside the crew. Unlike most war dramas of its era, Run Silent, Run Deep keeps the enemy mostly unseen, which only heightens the paranoia. Critics praised the performances, but noted the unusual bleakness for a Gable vehicle. This wasn't a romantic hero in uniform. It was a man chasing ghosts beneath the sea. Forgotten by many audiences today, Run Silent, Run Deep remains a defining entry in the war genre, not for its battles, but for its portrayal of obsession, rivalry, and the crushing weight of command. The Steel Helmet, 1951. The film that made Samuel Fuller a legend and rattled censors who weren't ready for its honesty. The Steel Helmet was the first American movie about the Korean War, shot while the conflict was still raging. On a shoestring budget of just $100,000, Fuller created a brutal, unforgettable story that challenged everything audiences thought they knew about combat. The plot follows a ragtag group of soldiers, led by Gene Evans as the cynical Sergeant Zach. From the first scene, where Zach crawls out of a pile of corpses, Fuller makes it clear, this isn't about glory, it's about survival. Along the way, the squad picks up a Buddhist boy and a black medic, sparking raw conversations about race, prejudice, and America's contradictions, conversations no other 1950s war film dared to stage. Shot in just 10 days in Los Angeles' Griffith Park, the film still feels gritty and real. The fog, the dirt, the improvised foxholes, every frame looks lived in. Fuller's background as a combat veteran gave him authority, but it also gave him anger. He wasn't interested in flag waving. He wanted to show the pain, the chaos, and the small mercies of war. The Army condemned the film for showing American soldiers committing questionable acts. That controversy only fueled its reputation as groundbreaking. Today, it's considered a landmark not just in war cinema, but in American independent film. Forgotten by casual viewers but cherished by film historians, The Steel Helmet didn't just define the war drama of the 1950s. It lit a fuse that would explode decades later in Vietnam films. Men in War 1957. No marching bands, no noble speeches, just two men clashing in the dust of Korea. Anthony Mann's Men in War strips away the myth of camaraderie to show war as a slow, grinding collapse of sanity. Starring Robert Ryan and Aldo Ray, it follows a ragged platoon trying to reach their battalion through enemy territory. Ryan plays Lieutenant Benson, a by-the-book officer clinging to discipline as his men fall apart around him. Ray is Sergeant Montana, a tough-as-nails loner who answers to no one. Their relationship becomes the film's backbone, discipline versus defiance, order versus survival instinct. Watching them square off is more tense than the firefights. Mann shot the film in bleak California landscapes that doubled for the Korean front. The barren hills and dusty roads make the soldiers look swallowed by nothingness, cut off from civilization and hope. This isn't a battlefield of glory. It's a wasteland that chews men up. Unlike the sanitized war, dramas of the era. Men in War doesn't flinch from exhaustion, paranoia, and breakdown. The men are seen stealing cigarettes, bickering, even abandoning each other under fire. The real enemy isn't just the unseen North Koreans, it's the creeping sense of futility. Between Heaven and Hell, 1956. What happens when a spoiled Southern aristocrat is stripped of privilege and dropped into combat? That's the core of Richard Fleischer's Between Heaven and Hell, one of the most surprising war dramas of the 1950s. Robert Wagner stars as Sam Gifford, a wealthy plantation owner who treats his workers like dirt, until war in the Pacific forces him to fight shoulder to shoulder with the very kind of men he once despised. From the opening, Wagner plays Gifford as arrogant, detached, and entitled. But as he's pushed deeper into the island jungles, he begins to unravel. His journey isn't about conquering territory. It's about learning humility in a world where class means nothing and survival means everything. The film takes a fascinating turn when Gifford is assigned to a penal unit under Broderick Crawford's sadistic sergeant. These are soldiers punished for disobedience, forced into suicidal missions, and Gifford is forced to depend on them to stay alive. Watching his transformation from detached officer to desperate survivor is what gives the film its bite. Shot on location in Hawaii, between heaven and hell, boasts lush landscapes that contrast brutally with the grim subject matter. The paradise setting becomes a cage of violence and moral reckoning. Critics of the day dismissed Wagner as too lightweight for the role, but looking back, his performance feels eerily authentic, maybe because the character's arrogance mirrored Wagner's early screen persona. It's a forgotten gem because it dared to say the quiet part out loud. War doesn't just kill men. The bridges at Toko-Ri, 1954. William Holden in the cockpit, Grace Kelly waiting at home, and one brutal question: what does war demand from ordinary men? The Bridges at Toko-Ri, directed by Mark Robson, is not a film about glory. It's about dread, sacrifice, and the quiet heartbreak behind military duty during the Korean War. Holden plays Lieutenant Harry Brubaker, a reservist pilot dragged back into combat after already serving in World War II. He doesn't want to be there. His life is with his wife, played by Grace Kelly, and their 2 children. Yet orders send him into one of the most dangerous assignments imaginable, flying jet strikes against heavily defended bridges in North Korea. The flight sequences remain astonishing. Filmed with full Navy cooperation, the movie features real aircraft carriers, jet takeoffs, and bombing runs. The roar of engines, the whistle of anti-aircraft fire, the silence after a hit, all of it feels authentic, immersive, and terrifying. But the film's real power lies not in spectacle, but in Brubaker's quiet moments of doubt and longing. He is not chasing medals. He is chasing a chance to come home alive. When the ending arrives, audiences expecting heroism were left shaken. Without spoiling, it doesn't deliver triumph. It delivers inevitability. The final note is tragic, devastating, and unforgettable. At the time, critics admired its honesty, with novelist James Michener, who wrote the source material, praising it for capturing the emotional truth of the war. Over the years, the film has faded from popular memory, overshadowed by louder war epics. But The Bridges at Toko-Ri stands as one of the 1950s most haunting dramas, asking the question that lingers long after the credits: where do we find such men? The Desert Rats, 1953. Richard Burton in the scorching sands of North Africa, fighting an enemy that seemed unstoppable. The Desert Rats is a tight, ferocious film about the siege of Tobruk, when a small force of Australian and British soldiers held off Rommel's Afrika Korps. It's not often remembered today, but at the time, it offered one of the decade's most tense portrayals of battlefield endurance. Burton plays Captain McRoberts, a stern British officer sent to whip a ragged Australian unit into shape. At first, the men resist his strict discipline, but as Rommel's tanks close in, McRoberts earns their respect the hard way, by sharing their misery in the trenches. James Mason, reprising his role as Rommel from The Desert Fox, brings class and menace to the German side, creating a duel of intellect as much as firepower. What makes The Desert Rats special is its focus on strategy and psychology. The soldiers know they can't win outright. Their job is to hold long enough to buy time. Every skirmish, every ruse, every act of stubborn defiance becomes a victory. Burton, still early in his career, brings raw intensity to the role, balancing arrogance with vulnerability. Director Robert Wise shot the film with an eye for tension, turning the desert into both a battlefield and a prison. Critics at the time praised its pacing, but dismissed it as too small-scale compared to bigger epics. Today, that intimacy is its strength. For a forgotten 1950s war drama, The Desert Rats shows how character, not spectacle, can define the fight. Go for Broke, 1951. A war film that dared to spotlight America's most overlooked heroes, the Japanese-American 442nd Regimental Combat Team. Go for Broke tells the true story of the Nisei soldiers who fought in Europe even as their families were locked in internment camps back home. In the 1950s, this was nothing short of radical. Van Johnson plays Lieutenant Grayson, a skeptical officer assigned to lead the 442nd. At first, He sees his men as outsiders, untested and suspect. But as the film progresses, their courage, skill, and sacrifice speak louder than prejudice ever could. By the end, Grayson's respect is not only earned, it's humbled. What sets Go for Broke apart is its casting. Real veterans of the 442nd appear alongside Hollywood actors, lending authenticity that no script could fake. Their presence brings weight to every firefight, every march, every sacrifice. Director Robert Pirosh, himself a World War II veteran, wrote and shot the film with respect and grit. The combat sequences are staged with precision, but it's the quiet moments, letters from home, shared meals, jokes in foxholes, that give the movie its heart. The film earned an Oscar nomination for Best Screenplay, but was quietly brushed aside in the patriotic 1950s climate. For decades, it remained underseen, though historians now hail it as one of the most important American war dramas of the era. Forgotten by many, Go for Broke defined the genre not with spectacle, but with courage, and with the reminder that heroism knows no color. These 15 films didn't parade across the big screen with trumpets and banners. They dug into the mud, the fear, the doubt, and showed us war as it really is. Forgotten by most audiences, they're the hidden backbone of 1950s war cinema. Which one surprised you most? Which deserves a comeback screening? Drop your thoughts in the comments, subscribe for more cinematic deep dives, and remember, history's greatest battles aren't always the ones we celebrate.